Hey guys, welcome back to Surviving This Horror. It's a podcast where I just rant about horror video games and why they're epic and cool. But if you can't tell, or if you're just listening, I'm doing something different. I'm doing something super unique. For the YouTube, when I publish this on YouTube, I am actually publishing a little video. Hence why the fun little video of me talking. But if you're just listening, it's still more fun because it just makes me really excited. And if you can't tell by the coloration, today we're going to be talking about Outlast by the green camcorder. And the green really hurts my eyes, so I'm just going to get the intro done, and then turn it off. But yeah, Surviving This Horror is a podcast hosted by me, Lily, where I just talk about a horror video game and why it's really cool. I talk about the franchise, its importance. Thanks to WIUX for sponsoring and assisting in this production. Really appreciate it. Really sorry for the huge disturbance, but if you're listening, I have a cool green filter. I got some gameplay in the background. You could probably look better. So yeah, and this is also a fun fact gameplay that I recorded myself. I didn't die. I played this game maybe 3 times, the first Outlast, and I always get stuck in this one part. Maybe I'll get to that later, and I usually die a lot, but I didn't because I knew I was recording. So yeah, I told myself to toughen up because if I was recording, then I wouldn't do it. So, like I said, today I'm going to be talking about Outlast. First, to give a little background and history, Red Barrels, the dev team behind the game, worked with bigger publishers like Ubisoft before Ubisoft. But Outlast was like their first actual real independent solo breakout game. And doing my research, I found out that it was made by a team of 10 people over like the span of a year, which is so crazy impressive that like such a small team can produce a game like this. And when this game launched, it was a hit due to the context at the time. I don't know if I discussed this before, but it was the peak jump scare reaction YouTuber horror video craze of the 2010s. Such examples include Layers of Fear, Five Nights at Freddy's, that's a huge one, Amnesia. These were like key games of the era where YouTubers at the time, like what comes to mind to me is like Markiplier, PewDiePie, people like that. They would play jump scare heavy independent horror games and it would get them a lot of views, and this was a huge just trend at a time. And I guess it should just be called like the indie horror games. Indie horror games were just getting spotlight and free publicity due to the popularity of YouTube. But some of these games, one thing that all these games just had in common with Outlast, and I'll get to that further, is that the jump scares and the high amount of jump scares and also the high amount of just like graphic themes. A lot of shock, a lot of edgy games of this time. The first game came out in 2013. With the second game and the DLC for the first game called Outlast Whistleblower coming out both in 2017, both at like the same time. And the most recent game came out in 2024 to sadly underwhelming attention, and I'll get to that further. So now let's get to the franchise speedrun, and just me summarizing and giving pros and cons of every single game in the franchise. So first, let's start with Outlast. Let's start with the grand pappy of them all. It's a first-person survival, psychological horror, gross horror, where you play as a journalist that can't fight back at all. You can't kill anything, or really even do anything cool. You can just run and hide. You're a journalist trapped in a literal insane asylum where illegal MK Ultra tests are being subjected on the patients, which is honestly like, the devs just slapped every single nightmare-inducing urban legend they could think of into a game, and that's Outlast. So some pros of the game. It draws iconic horror tropes in the most perfect way. It makes the game super grimy. I feel super, super dirty whenever I play the game and like the other games because of the environments, such as the insane asylum setting, the mentally crazy patients, the MK Ultra underground government psychological torture testing, mad scientists. These are all like just other reoccurring horror tropes and themes. The hulking, bloodthirsty killing machine with the I don't know his name, but the little pig. The Haunted Mansion is kind of got like the Resident Evil Mansion vibes with the underground secret lab, just like Resident Evil. And it's honestly kind of like torture porn in a way, like the Saw movies. It was fresh and innovative gameplay, loop for the time at least. At the gaming industry at the time was very first-person shooter based. Still kind of is, where like it's gun ho, gun action based, and even in horror games at the time, i.e., like Gears of War, it took it was very, very action central. But this game took the power away from the player and made the game super scarily challenging. You can't kill anything, you can only run and hide. And this makes the game super scary because you, the player, are projecting yourself onto the main character, the main protagonist, and you feel incredibly helpless and defenseless and animalistic in a sense, just running from like a predator chasing you basically. It takes that power of the gun hose and just rips it away and makes you pee your pants and hide in fear. There's simple but yet very unique enemy design, like the pig guy I was just mentioning. He's the bloodthirsty tank that visibly shows that in his build that he could just like obliterate you into red atoms, because he's just this built, scarred man thing. There's an evil doctor. He has very obvious, very mad scientist, mad doctor vibes with his like crooked glasses, his strangly hair, his bloody cloak, his like hand claws and everything. He's super cocky and curious, and he also walks with this just cock out basically while he's like holding a giant pair of scissors and chasing after you and wanting to experiment on you, which kind of shows his stance on cleanliness. And the environment of the neglected asylum itself reflects onto the enemies perfectly. It just makes you almost pity them in a way because it's just so gross and sad that these people are just thrown away and ignored like that. But you also realize that they just want you dead for their own sick reasons, that the asylum in a way is almost twisting them with the MK Ultra shit. The strategy of using a camera to view the dark is super creative, and like looking for batteries, running low on batteries is a constant anxiety during the whole game, and it adds another fear to it because once your camera dies, you're just stuck in like a super dark hallway and you're fucked. You don't know what you're walking into. You can only use audio, but you don't know which direction you're going, so you have to find batteries immediately. It adds another natural fear to the gameplay. Unfortunately, let's get to the cons. Every game has their cons. The game is this is a personal complaint. The game is just way too dark, like lighting wise, it's way too dark. I understand why it needs to be dark. I just think it needs to be spaced out more. At least in the intro, it's pretty spaced out. Like I only replayed the intro, I didn't replay the whole game. I just remember the rest of the game being so fucking dark. It's constantly dark, and it makes the unique camera gimmick like useful and fun, and like I mean I get it. Black, void, infinite darkness. And I always have to like in the settings turn my brightness all the way up to max, and it's just really annoying. And also, speaking with the lighting, it also has like it has some sort of like weird filter. I wrote down in my notes it's the piss curse of the early 2000s, like the New Mexico piss filter like in Breaking Bad, but it's not even that now that I replayed it recently, but it has kind of like an ugly, maybe it's just the environment itself is really gross and grimy and yellow and muddy and brown and gross. It makes it look just way too yellow and muddy, but I don't know. That's just a personal complaint. I guess this is a con, but just depending what you're into, it's a very, very graphic game, and like the Saw movies, it's just like violence and gratuitous gore for gore's sake. This game at times just like really heavily just leans on that, falls into that for shock value. And in a sense, it's just somewhat dated and edgy with leaning onto the torture porn feel. The ending of the game, in my opinion, is a little weak. It tells the overarching plot with the evil Murkoff Corp through mainly just text, and then the final, like, spoilers, ghost boss that's like the MK Ultra thing just seems kind of rushed. It's like the final boss, but they didn't really build it up very well. It just seemed, it kind of unfortunately shows that they only had a year to work on the game. So now let's talk about the Outlast Whistleblower DLC. The plot of the game is that someone working at the Murkoff Corp, the Murkoff Corporation is the people that own the insane asylum, sees all the crew stuff going on, and he tips the journalist. The journalist's name's, by the way, I forgot to mention, his name is Miles Upshur, something like that. He tips him by sending you an email. He's the main character of the first game, to investigate what's going on. It kind of just shows the origins of some of the main enemies from the first Outlast game, showing how they were like mentally deranged and how the Project Walrider, that's what the Ghost stuff, and MK Ultra stuff like advanced it and fucked with it. So let's talk about some pros. The new main antagonist, his name is the Bachelor. His enemy and design and being added to like a mini DLC game is super, super interesting, super unique, and super fucking terrifying, and I really wish that they put him in the actual original game or somehow work that into the plot, because he's really iconic. He has really good horror, classic slasher horror design. He is a bachelor, like a mad husband, romantic themed murderer, stalking the player, as the enemies do, and he has like a twisted idea of what marriage is and what gender roles are. He's trying to turn you into his bride, and he'll do whatever it takes, even chopping up your genitalia, even if that entails it. He also, in my opinion, just has like super good voice acting. It makes his character really good. It has the similar pros to the first game. It has a perfect length and price for a DLC at the time, and has good plot, good lore added to the universe that the devs created. It was pretty fun. Now let's talk about some cons. It's even more graphic. It's still very graphic. It just comes off as dirty shock value, and it works, but it's just not really in good taste. And it kind of aged poorly with the edgy shock genre. Especially converting, I touched on this, but especially converting the man into the perfect bride scene with Eddie. That's the name of the Bachelor, Eddie Gluskin. He starts freaking out. It's really gross and really scary. But when you go back to like think on it after you play the game, or just looking back a couple years on it, you can just kind of see how it's just really, really disturbing. And some people might be into that. I think it's super disturbing, but I also just understand why people are kind of offset by that. So now moving on to the second game officially, Outlast 2. A cameraman and his wife, who's a news journalist, investigate a murdered pregnant woman. Here's the shock again. This middle of nowhere, New Mexico, southwestern U.S. area. I don't remember the state. Until they crash land into the middle of like a hick Jonestown cult. There's a religion war occurring between two twisted cults, and the wife also now all of a sudden is randomly pregnant. And while this is all happening, the main character experiences religious trauma all over again from his childhood surrounding a diddler priest. There's a lot of, you could tell now, my complaints with how shock-based the franchise is. But let's start with some pros. It does a really good job expanding on the overarching plot through the undertones with the Murkoff Corporation, but it also does something new with adding a new character and a new story to tell. It doesn't really feel weighed down or overshadowed by the other game, but it incorporates the gameplay mechanics with like the running and hiding, the camera and everything from the first game super easily into the second game super flawlessly. And it makes sense with the story as well. Like, it made sense with the first story with, what was his name? Miles Upshur? Yeah, Miles Upshur. He's a journalist. He's an independent journalist, so you understand why he's recording all this. And then same with the newscaster team. You understand why they have to record this, even for their own survival. A super good video game psychological horror. It's so unique from the first person point of view and the transitions and everything. Super good and integrates with the plot into the game. The in-game transitions, I already talked about this, between reality and the protagonist's like nightmare past are just so cool. I love it. Has really good monster design representing his past demons. It's super cool setting for the childhood trauma in the private Christian Catholic school. It still makes a really strong yet terrifying contrast to the real setting that he's experiencing. He's trapped in the bloody, grimy, gross, dark desert, and then this is compared to the more sterile, pristine, proper private school, but like it's slightly off. There's lots of horror motifs inspired from the including, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's a really good one, with the ass backwards bumpkin murder family, torture porn, gore, creepy haunted school, childhood psychological trauma, specifically surrounding SA, if you know what that acronym is supposed to mean. Western Gothic horror, with the religious horror as well being the central theme and plastered everywhere. And then there's also, like, references to, like, The Shining, to Silent Hill, stuff like that. It's really interesting. And then they also add a new mechanic to keep the franchise fresh. Specifically, they add the microphone. It's a super helpful addition to hiding because it adds more strategy and adaptation for the player to avoid enemies and, like, gauge how far or close one is. And it's utilized exclusively in some areas where, like, your glow-in-the-dark light is broken, and it's already super fucking scary that you're stuck in the dark, but you have to rely just on audio. It's so scary, but it makes it that's why it's fun. That's why it's a good gimmick and a good thing to add, because it adds a new sense of fear. So, cons. Yet again, it's super graphic, especially with the implied essay. How do I phrase this? It's adds to the horror, but I think there is a essay scene that aged poorly and is kind of distasteful. I'll describe the context without being graphic. It's when the main character is in a cave and one of the leaders, who is a hermaphrodite, captures him and knocks him out, drugs him, I believe. He drugs him, and it's just so disturbing and graphic, and in my opinion, is a little distasteful. And sexuality and pregnancy and sexual essay are very large themes in the game, and a lot of them are handled pretty well, especially with the childhood trauma. That, I think, is handled very well, whereas the cave R scene, moving on. Run into, like, very similar environments. This gameplay loop can just get stale. I, and many other people, want so much more psychological horror content in this game. What was in it was executed so well, with the chase scenes, with the transitions, with the themes, everything, the environments. It was slapped in small crumbs sprinkled throughout the game, and the players, that's why it's good, because once you experience it, the players wanted to learn more about the story and the lore, and also have a new change in environment. But it was so just limited that the players just wanted more, and I really want to see this done more throughout the franchise, this type of psychological horror. And the first game also had this issue, is that the ending is just all over the place, but I think this game definitely experiences it the most. It's very bombastic, it's very big, and it kind of just rushes the plot incredibly poorly. Like, for example, one of the main antagonists, he's the cult leader, not the one I just talked about, a different one. He just, like, offs himself randomly. Like, you never fight him, and you rarely even see him in the game except through, like, murals. And this is the second and final cutscene with him, and you just, like, ends his life. And it's just kind of out of the blue. I don't know, it just seemed very poorly written, in my opinion. And now let's get on to the last game. Outlast Trials is a prequel to all the others. It takes place in Soviet Cold War Russia, when the Murkoff Corporation was kind of being born. Experimentation on victims by welding night vision goggles, headsets onto their heads, you drugging them, and then just forcing them to face new scary foes. And it's multiplayer compatible, and it's actually encouraged that you play on multiplayer. But like I said, no combat, but stealth is heavily influenced, much like the other games. And it kind of enforces it has new gameplay strategies to trick enemies and stuff like that, and evade enemies. So let's get on to the pros. I'm already kind of... I sadly didn't play this one, but I'm already kind of glazing it. Unfortunately, I did not get to play this game myself, but Outlast, in a weird way, has always been kind of a strong contender for multiplayer platform, and it's finally used, and used very well. You get the experiencing the horror in a group is always just fun, and then working together to survive as a team, to survive the trials and complete tasks is not only fun, it kind of adds to the new gameplay loop, inspired by the other two games, but builds off it and just breathes new fresh air into it finally. Has a cool setting and cool lighting. It's very like haunted house-esque with the trials. Like an abandoned, broken scientific medical lab vibes, stuff like that. And the game is also not annoyingly dark anymore, thank God! Who gave them the memo? The boss designs, in my opinion, are not the best in the franchise, but they're still, you give credit where credit's due. They're still fun and creepy and unique and very outlasty. I think the cop guy, I like him the most because he has a weird, like, sadistic taser fetish, and like, it's comical but creepy in a way. He just like zaps his junk. And I think it's charming. And also I found out while researching that this game has, I'll get to this later, but I actually didn't like know much about this game, but I found out that it had multiple endings, which is kind of cool, not gonna lie. The agents, that's what you play as. Like, there's no, like, I don't know, whatever. You complete a final trial before becoming a Russian sleeper agent, which leads to, like, different multiple endings depending on how good or bad you do. And then, last point is that there's a similar color palette to the first game, with the obvious greens from the infrared camera, but also, like, the dingy yellows, muddy browns, and splattered reds just sets the environment and tone very well. And to me, personally, it acts as, like, almost as a form of nostalgia. So, let's get to the final cons. This is what I was kind of touching on earlier, but I don't know about the marketing campaign surrounding this game, but I remember when, like, some YouTubers were playing it, like, and I thought they were, like, playing, like, the beta or, like, early access of the game, but I don't, like, actually remember a drop date or when the game actually was, like, you know, released for the market. And maybe that's on my part because, like, my feed wasn't marketed well. But, like, I just think the hype surrounding it wasn't very good, wasn't very strong. You can prove me wrong, but I personally don't think so. The game kind of just came and went, and people forgot that it even happened, and that's really just, like, the only con and biggest gripe that I have with this game, because I actually haven't personally played it myself to come up with more cons, yeah. So what? Let's get to the meat and potatoes, or just kind of me wrapping everything up. What's important and influential about this game is the shock in indie horror YouTube genre at the time, which boosted the lasting power and gave the game actually, like, a platform in some kind of solid way that other indie games probably didn't get. And I touched on this briefly, like, at the beginning, but it just shows, like, a good historical point in the context of YouTube and how far we've come, and, like, actually what gets released on YouTube and what gets censored on YouTube. Like, it's a really good, I guess, thought experiment, or a good thing to look back on, where, like, YouTubers nowadays can't say certain words, can't show certain stuff because, or else they'll get demonetized, age restricted, shit like that. Whereas back in the day, like early 2000s, like, people were just playing Outlast and, like, fully showing, or maybe in their personal reasons, like, cutting a little bit, but, like, would fully show, like, the gore and violence and, like, essay scenes, and it was very shocking, and it's just how far we come, I guess, is just really interesting. Also, I already talked about this, but the whole franchise takes inspiration from various themes and tropes and keeps them super scary from, like, film and mass media, and especially other games. Outlast is kind of like a time capsule of all the horror trends of its time, and it contains references and ideas from horrors all around. Like, for example, Saw, torture porn. It's a very relevant franchise or horror theme. The found footage, that's a very good one. The found footage was huge during the 2000s, the green lighting and everything. It was a perfect time capsule. It's unique and extra scary in the sense that you actually can't fight or kill off the enemies. You can just only run and hide, which unfortunately gets old super quick, and yeah, but it was definitely unique compared to the shooters and horror shooter games at the time. Taking the power away from the player makes it scary, and then just throwing them into, like, an inhumane, unnatural, super unsafe habitat where you just have fight or flight, except fight is removed and it's survival or hide, shit like that. It's really interesting. Unfortunately, with the current gameplay loop and hide-and-go-seek franchise that Red Barrel's kind of set up Outlast to be, they kind of have had like just limited games. This is all they're doing, and the staying power into the future, I don't really see anything unique unless they go super off script and do something super, super new and unique for the Outlast franchise to, you know, I guess, freshen up the franchise itself. So, to wrap everything up, Outlast is a super grimy and gross franchise, making the players run for all their lives, constantly fearing what lurks around every single stupid fucking corner. A combination of psychological horror and mass gore, psychopaths, religious horror, and secret testing facilities, it throws the players into various haunted house-esque locations with a crazy cast of mentally deranged individuals, some with supernatural powers, and some not. If you dig this and you want to hear more, go to WIUX's website on the podcast tab or listen through Newgrounds or YouTube. And like I said at the beginning, you can watch the actual video. This might just be a one-time thing. I might do it a couple of times in the future. Since it's a new semester, I want to do something new fresh start. If you're watching this on YouTube or you're just listening to it on YouTube, or if you're, it doesn't matter. If you're listening to it, I apologize for how shitty my camera is. I am new to this, and I'm gonna try something new, and I'm just doing something for fun. But go follow me on Instagram, Twitter. I have a Newgrounds. I also post audio on Newgrounds, all of which you can, the ats are survivethis.wiux. And once again, thank you, WIUX, for the assistance, and thank you for listening and stopping by and just hearing me rant about Outlast. Yeah, I hope I get to see you next time.